All right, greetings everyone. Chief Meteorologist Chad Merrill here with our spring outlook covering the months of March, April, and May. We did a Facebook Live in the studio yesterday, answered a couple of questions that you had, but this is for those who did not get a chance to participate in the Facebook Live and don't have Facebook. This is basically the entire slideshow, and I'll go through it in detail for you. And of course, if you have any questions, you can post them on our YouTube channel. So I'm first of all going to share my screen, and what you are going to see is what I'm going to be referencing, heating and cooling degree days. The average temperature of the day compared to a base temperature of 65 degrees is what NOAA uses to classify these heating and cooling degree days. Basically, at 65 degrees, that's when you start to think about turning on the heat in your house during the wintertime. And it's also a baseline for cooling degree days in the summertime. The energy industry uses it to prepare for upcoming heating and cooling demand, depending on if there's an Arctic blast coming through or if there's a heat wave during the summer. So when we have above average heating degree days on these graphs that I will show you, that means you will have a higher heating bill. The more above that average line, the higher the heating bill is going to be. And above average cooling degree days means a high AC bill or air conditioner bill. So with that in mind, we are going to show you what are called stacked area charts. That allows us to track the cumulative totals better than the absolute value. So let's say we have a 5-day stretch where several of our analog years show the temperature is 3 to 5 degrees below average. On the graph, it'll show the last day in that cold cycle as being 15, 20, 30 degrees below average because it's taking the cumulative total of the past couple of days that have been below average. I use these stack area charts to show you visually the fluctuations in temperatures because it's a very good visual reference so you can see where it's going to be colder and warmer than average for an extended period of time. Now, don't interpret it as being 30 degrees above normal or 30 degrees below normal, but the cumulative effect of the cold weather over that period of days. So, for example, the heating degree day example from this past winter was January 2024. We all remember we had the snow in the middle of January and bitterly cold temperatures. So there was a spike in energy costs. The average baseline for heating costs is about 30 heating degree days in the month of January, but we exceeded that when the cold blast came through. But then you remember it warmed up significantly towards the end of January. So there was a decline in energy cost because we had fewer than average heating degree days. So above this black line, it would cost you more to heat your house. Below this line, it costs less to heat your house. Now, an example of a cooling degree day from an entire month is July 2023. All this data is from the Beckley Airport. Above the threshold, which is 6 cooling degree days, it would cost more to cool your home. And below this, it would cost less to cool your home. So you can see in the first 9 days of the month, temperatures were pretty close to average. So your heating bill wasn't extraordinary. But a little bit of a cool spell. So maybe you turned your air conditioner off for a few hours around July 11th. We had a little bit of a spike around the 13th and 14th, but the biggest spike in energy costs to cool your house was the end of January when temperatures were in the upper 80s. So again, above this baseline is where you have a spike in energy cost, in this case because of excessive warmth. When we look at our analog years, and how I determined the analog years was we came from a strong El Nino, and El Nino is starting to fade as the sea surface temperature anomalies in the Pacific start to cool down. So we are going to transition into a weak El Nino during the months of March, April, and May, which is meteorological spring. So in this stacked area chart, we're looking at the daily temperature trends for March. And notice there's a tendency for March to start cooler than average for several days. And then there's a tendency for a spike in temperatures followed by another cool blast around the 11th and 12th. And then we have these fluctuations up and down until we get to about the 26th of March. And then from the 26th to the 31st, there's a pretty good signal for a sustainable warm trend. So we start out, likely we'll start out March cooler than average, and then have these progressive fronts come through, warm out ahead of it, cool behind it, and then at the end of the month have a more sustainable warm pattern. When we looked at the heating degree days for March analog years, in March, you tend to see the number of heating degree days decline as the month continues because the average temperature warms up, the sun is out for a longer period of time, and the sun angle is higher. All of that factors into less heating cost for your house because of the warmer temperatures. So if you look at the baseline here and the number of heating degree days, we're actually in check for most of the month. There's a couple of little minor spikes, but what this shows me is that there's not going to be a strain on your electric bill to heat your house during the month of March. When we looked at cooling degree days in March, now many of you probably don't even turn on the air conditioner in March, but the only trend that I see is towards the end of the month, and this might be a good opportunity for you to test your air conditioner system to make sure it's functioning properly. But there's only one analog year that produced a spike in cooling degree days. So chances are you probably won't need the air conditioner unless you want to test it. And the best chance to test it will be between March 28th and the 31st. As we transition to April, this is the stacked area chart for daily temperature trends. And the biggest item to note is that we have a little bit of a sustainable cool pattern from April 8th to 12th. Otherwise, temperatures do fluctuate above and below average, but not to the point where it deviates too much from the zero line, which is basically near average temperatures for April. So other than this little spike of cool weather between the 8th and the 12th of April, we're not really seeing any upside potential to any long-term cold or long-term warmth. As for heating degree days, where we saw that dip in the temperature, we have a spike in heating degree days. So for a couple of days there in April, you might have to turn on the air conditioner between the 7th and the 12th. But otherwise, heating degree days are at or below average, so probably not going to cost you too much to heat your house in April. And then when we look at cooling degree days, there's a little bit of a spike with one analog year in the very beginning of April. So if you don't test out your air conditioner at the end of March, perhaps you can do it in early April when we get a good strong likelihood of a warm spell for a couple of days at least. Now, as for May, we do note that there is a little bit of a cooling trend between about the 4th and the 11th of May during these weak El Nino years. Otherwise, when we look towards the opposite end of the month, we do see a little bit of a sustainable warm trend from the 25th through the 31st. So there are some trends there, and these cool anomalies in the beginning and warm anomalies in the end would probably balance out a little bit for temperatures. For heating degree days in the month of May, well, other than maybe 1 or 2 nights in the beginning of the month, you probably won't need your heater on at all. We're basically below that threshold. And just like with March and what we saw with April is we typically have fewer heating degree days as the month of May goes on because the average temperature warms up and it costs a lot less to heat your house and there's fewer number of heating degree days. And then for cooling degree days in May, chances are there's 3 analog years in which there were an excessive number of cooling degree days. In other words, the best chance for you to have to use your air conditioner for a couple of days would be between the 27th of May and the 31st. Otherwise, not seeing any upside or downside risk for cooling degree days. And then when we look at precipitation, so now we're going to transition to precipitation in March. This is the same trend with the stacked area chart. When you have a couple of days with precipitation, it stacks up like textbook stacking up, and we add that value exponentially. So we do see a spike in precipitation around the 12th and 13th of March, and then around the 20th, which is obviously the spring equinox. But other than that, we don't really see any upside potential to any very wet periods in March. April and May, we start to see more precipitation as it is because that's just climatology around here. We get more moisture in the atmosphere, more moisture-logged systems. So what we see is a bit of an upside potential for a period of heavier rain between April 21st and the 30th. Otherwise, we're not deviating too much from 0 to half an inch towards the beginning of the month. So the wettest period in April will be towards the end of the month. Then we look at May patterns. Looks like we start out the month of May on the wet side, and there's a little bit of a spike here in the first 10 days, but there's some big ups and downs here towards the rest of the month. And to me, that what that indicates is that we'll have a progressive weather pattern with some rain out ahead of it and some dry weather behind these fronts, but nothing appreciable or significant. Now, we're transitioning from precipitation, which includes rain, melted snow, and any ice, to snowfall. We all want to know, are we going to have a snowy spring or a late winter, so to speak? So the only couple of days that stand out in March for snow would be the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of March. And then if you look at these spikes, I mean, 7 inches, there was one analog year that produced 7 inches of snow around March 3rd, and one that produced 8 inches of snow around the 22nd. So overall, we'll probably get 1 or 2 small snow events in the first 10 days of March, and maybe a little bit of snow around the equinox. But overall, not seeing any upside potential to a very snowy March or above average snow. When we look at snowfall anomalies in April, there are 3 years that did produce about an inch of snow around April 8th. So it wouldn't surprise me if we get a little bit of a cold blast in early April that produces a very light snow across the region, otherwise not seeing any potential going forward through the rest of the month. And then in May, there was one analog year that produced 1/10 of an inch of snow around May 10th. And that's where we saw the spike in cooler anomalies. So I don't think we're going to have a repeat of the heavy snow that we had in Snowshoot last year in May. This data is specifically for the Beckley Airport, but I would not expect an anomalous system in May to produce an excessive amount of snow. So we covered temperatures, heating degree days, cooling degree days, and precipitation and snow. Now let's look at severe weather, because once we get into April and May, especially, we have an increased risk for severe weather historically. When we look at the influence of El Nino on tornado frequency across southern West Virginia and even across much of the area east of the Rockies, there tends to be a lower frequency or less than average tendency for tornadoes to form during El Nino springs, whereas during a La Nina, there's a little bit of an upside risk for severe weather. So what this is showing is that once we get into March, April, May, there is more of a downside risk to severe weather across our region compared to an upside risk for bad weather. Two of my analog years, 1998 and 2016, ranked in this chart. This is when you accumulate the number of severe thunderstorm warnings and tornado warnings issued by the National Weather Service in Charleston, West Virginia, and we rank them on a scale of 1 to 10 during the spring season. So we're basically looking at just March, April, and May here. There were 2 years in which there were a large number of these warnings issued, May 24th, 98, and May 1st, 2016. So what this shows is that maybe we go through the whole spring season with very little severe weather, and perhaps once we get into the middle and latter part of May, we have the potential for a larger outbreak across our region. So I just want to show you this because even if we have a below average season, there still can be a few active days within that. And if we do have an active period, it would likely be the beginning of May or the end of May. And then finally, here's the lowdown. I don't expect any excessive heating bills or heating bills, overall electric bills due to heating your home during the spring season. Now, the first test of the functionality of your air conditioner unit, likely between March 30th and April 7th. That's when you can make sure it works okay. And if it doesn't, you have time to repair it before we get into very warm temperatures. Most of the precipitation will be in the middle of March, late April, and early May, and most of that would be rain. I expect 1 or 2 minor snowfall events between the March 3rd and 16th and April 8th. I don't expect a blockbuster storm like we had in 1993 with the blizzard of 93. I don't see any sign for that happening this coming spring. And there's a downside risk to an active severe weather season. Most of that should be in the month of May. And many of you do suffer from allergies when we get to that time of the year, which is just around the corner. And when I look at the data, April 1st through 7th stands out, a likely increase in temperatures and perhaps the dry period as well. It's the warm, dry days that contribute to the enhanced allergy season. And I do expect the brunt of the allergy season will be between about April 1st and 20th, and then a final spike towards the middle part of May. So that is a general overview of what I expect going forward through the spring season. If you have any questions about the information that I presented, just reach out to me. All right, Chief Meteorologist Chad Merrill from Newswatch.